There are moments in life when something outside of you knows before you do. Not a voice, not a sign. Something quieter than that. A stillness that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave until you pay attention to it. Most people dismiss those moments. They push through them. They tell themselves it was nothing, that they were tired, that the world doesn't work that way. But sometimes, the world does work that way. And sometimes, what saves you isn't your own wisdom or your own eyes or your own instincts at all. Sometimes what saves you is something that cannot speak, and yet manages to say everything in the length of a single, suspended breath. This is a story about that kind of moment. About a man named Elias Vaughan, and a horse named Gray, in an October afternoon that neither of them should have survived. Elias was not a sentimental man. He would have told you that himself, without embarrassment. He was practical in the way that men raised on difficult land tend to become. He measured things. He fixed things. He did not spend much time talking about feelings, because feelings, in his experience, did not fix fences or keep grain dry or bring water up from a stubborn well. He had grown up in the low country of Western Moravia, in a valley that the maps barely acknowledged, where the hills rolled in slow green waves and the rivers ran cold even in summer. His father had worked the same land that his father had worked, and the expectation had always been quiet and absolute. You stayed. You learned. You carried it forward. Elias had stayed. He had learned. He had carried it for 34 years, and the weight of it had shaped him into someone still and dependable. The way stone eventually becomes smooth not from softness but from patience. His wife, Marta, had loved that about him. The steadiness of him. The way he never wavered. She had been gone for 3 years now, and the steadiness had not left him, but it had hollowed out somehow. It was still there on the surface. Underneath it, something had shifted, like the ground after a long winter. The structure holding, but the interior changed in ways you couldn't quite see. He didn't talk about that either. Gray had come to him 6 years ago. Not in any dramatic way. There was no story of rescue, no moment of choosing. A neighbor 2 valleys over had more horses than he could keep, and Elias had been looking for a trail horse that could handle the steep terrain behind the property without complaint. And the neighbor had brought him out to the paddock one quiet morning, and Gray had simply walked over and stood beside him without being called. That was it. That was the whole story. But Elias had not forgotten the way the horse moved toward him. Calm and deliberate, without hesitation, as if something had already been decided. Gray was not a spectacular animal by any visible measure. He was a solid dun-colored gelding, built low and wide, with a large sensible head and a temperament that almost nothing could disturb. He did not spook at birds or thunder or the sudden movement of branches in wind. He did not shy at dogs or machinery or the unfamiliar smells of strangers. He simply moved through the world with a quiet competence that Elias, over time, had come to trust more than almost anything else he knew. He had ridden Gray through every season of those 6 years. He had ridden him across the valley in spring floods, picking careful lines through the water. He had ridden him through midsummer heat when the air shimmered and the trail dust rose in pale clouds. He had ridden him in the first hard snows of winter, the horse placing each hoof with measured precision as if he were navigating something fragile. In all that time, Gray had never once refused a step. Not once. Until the afternoon of the 13th of October, in the 3rd year after Marta had gone. The day had begun without particular character. It was the kind of October day that feels borrowed from summer, warmer than it should be, the sky a blue so clear and flat it seemed almost artificial. The trees had begun to turn in earnest, and the hillsides above the property were washed in amber and copper and deep rust, the kind of color that looks lit from within. Elias had finished his morning work earlier than expected. The fence line along the northern pasture had needed checking, and he had checked it and found it solid. The grain storage was dry. The animals were settled. There was still 3 hours before the light would start to go. He saddled Gray without much thought, more from habit than from plan. He often rode in the late afternoon when the season allowed it. He rode the same trail most times, the one that climbed from the back of the property into the low hills and then curved east along a ridge before dropping back into the valley. It was a comfortable ride. 2 hours if he moved without hurry. Long enough to let the day settle in him before evening. He mounted in the yard, adjusted the stirrups, and rode out through the gate. Gray moved at his usual pace. Easy. Unhurried. His ears relaxed and angled forward in the mild way they did when nothing was asking for his attention. The first half of the trail was open, following the edge of the pasture before climbing into the tree line. Elias let the reins hang loose. He wasn't thinking about much. That was the point of these rides, mostly. Not to think. Not to plan. Just to move through space and let the accumulation of the day dissolve. He passed the old stone marker that stood at the edge of the upper pasture, a boundary post that had been there since before his grandfather's time, mossy now and leaning slightly south. He passed the stand of old beeches where the trail narrowed, their roots enormous and tangled across the path, pale as old bone. He passed the place where the small stream crossed the trail, the water low this time of year, barely a trickle over the flat stones. Gray navigated all of it without comment. The trail rose after the stream crossing. It steepened gradually, the surface changing from soft earth to packed stone, and the trees grew closer together here, their canopies meeting overhead and filtering the afternoon light into something dim and layered. The air changed too. It cooled. It took on that particular quality that forest air has in autumn, clean and slightly sweet, with something underneath it that wasn't quite decay, but was close to it. The smell of transformation. Things letting go. Elias had always liked this part of the trail. He had ridden it so many times that he stopped seeing it consciously and simply felt it. The rhythm of the horse beneath him. The quality of the light. The particular sounds of this piece of land. The creak of branches. The small rustling of creatures in the undergrowth. The intermittent percussion of a woodpecker somewhere to the east. All of it present. All of it ongoing. And then, without transition, without warning of any kind, Gray stopped. Not slowed. Not hesitated. Stopped. A full, sudden halt. Like hitting a wall that wasn't there. Elias's body lurched forward slightly with the inertia of it, his hands gripping the saddle horn out of instinct. For a moment, he thought the horse had stumbled, had put a foot wrong on the rocky ground and caught himself short. He looked down at the trail. There was nothing. The ground was the same ground it had been for the last quarter mile. Flat stones. Packed earth between them. Perfectly ordinary. He looked up. The trail ahead was clear. No fallen branch. No animal in the path. Nothing. He pressed his heel gently to Gray's flank. The horse did not move. Elias pressed again, firmer this time. Gray stood like a stone. It wasn't stubbornness. He knew what that looked like in a horse, the flick of the tail, the slight swing of the hindquarters, the low resistance. This was different. Gray was standing absolutely still, his entire body collected, tense in that particular way that was not fear but something closer to focused attention. His ears were locked forward, both of them pointing at the exact same spot on the trail ahead, rigid as compass needles. He was not looking at anything Elias could see. His breathing was steady, deep and regular. The way an animal breathes when it is concentrating, not panicking. Elias looked at the trail again. Then at the trees on either side. Then at the sky above the canopy. Nothing. The forest was perfectly ordinary. Perfectly quiet. Too quiet. It arrived as a thought first, and then as a physical sensation, a slight tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. The forest was quiet in a way that it had not been 30 seconds ago. The woodpecker had stopped. The rustling in the undergrowth had stopped. The distant sounds that he had not even consciously registered as sounds, the faint background noise of living things going about their ordinary business, that had stopped too. Everything had stopped. The air felt strange. Not cold, but changed. Heavier. Pressed in from all sides in a way that was hard to name. Elias sat very still and listened. There was nothing to hear. He tried to remember the last time he had experienced total silence in this forest, and he could not remember it happening at all. Even in deep winter, when the snow muffled everything and the birds had gone, there was always something. Wind, a branch settling, water moving somewhere under ice. Something. Not now. Now there was nothing. And inside that nothing, an unease began to build in him that he couldn't reason away. He had spent his entire life outdoors. He knew land. He knew weather. He knew animals. He was not prone to imagination or to the kind of anxiety that invented danger where none existed. But the horse wouldn't move. And the forest had gone silent. And the air felt wrong in a way he could not name. For one long moment, something in him wanted to push through it. To press Gray forward again, firmly, and break the moment by force of will. To tell himself that he was a grown man on a trail he had ridden 100 times, and that horses stopped and forests went quiet and there was nothing remarkable about any of it. He didn't. He didn't, because Gray was still standing with every cell of his body directed at something ahead. And 34 years of working with animals had taught Elias that when an animal like that, calm, experienced, utterly unflappable, directed that quality of attention somewhere, the correct response was not to dismiss it. It was to pay attention. He sat. He breathed. He waited. The silence held for perhaps 2 minutes. It could have been less. It felt longer. Time does strange things inside moments like that. It stretches. It thickens. It makes each second feel like something you have to move through rather than something that simply passes. Elias counted his own heartbeats at some point. He was not aware of having decided to do this. He simply noticed that he was doing it, feeling the pulse in his fingertips where they rested on the reins, counting without meaning to. Gray did not move. Did not shift weight. Did not flick an ear. The forest stayed silent. And then, very slowly, Elias became aware of something else. Something that was not a sound, but was not quite not a sound either. A feeling in the ground, almost. A vibration. The faintest possible trembling, the kind of thing you might feel through the soles of boots pressed flat against earth, not through a saddle on a horse on a stone and dirt trail. But he felt it. Or thought he felt it. He could not be certain. And without knowing exactly why, he reached forward and turned Gray's head gently to the left, away from the trail, away from whatever direction those locked ears were pointing, and he asked the horse for a step back. Just one step. Away. Gray moved immediately. No hesitation. No resistance. The moment Elias asked for backward movement rather than forward, the horse responded with complete willingness, stepping back and then turning as Elias guided him, retracing the trail in the direction they had come from. They had gone perhaps 15 steps when it happened. The wind came. It came from the east, from behind the ridgeline, and it did not arrive the way wind usually arrived, gradually, feeling its way into a space. It arrived all at once, a solid wall of moving air that tore through the tree line with a sound like breaking. The canopy above the trail erupted. Branches bent. Leaves stripped free in sheets and drove sideways. The trunks of the beeches groaned in a way that sounded almost human. And then, from somewhere just ahead, from the exact section of trail where they had been standing, there came a sound that Elias felt as much as heard. A deep, tearing crack. Then another. Then the long, low groan of something enormous giving way. He turned in the saddle. A tree had come down across the trail. Not a dead tree. Not a standing snag. A living beech, its root plate torn free from the ground by whatever combination of factors had been building unseen beneath the surface, the root structure undermined perhaps by the long summer and the low water, the standing weight of it finally exceeding what the ground could hold. It had come down sideways, completely, branches and all, filling the width of the trail in both directions. Right where they had been. Exactly where they had been. The trunk was as thick as Elias's torso. The canopy, now spread across the trail like a fallen wall, was enormous. There would have been no warning. No sound of cracking. Not before the thing moved. Tree falls are like that. They are silent, and then they are catastrophic, with almost nothing between those two states. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the trunk, at the root plate standing upright now like a dark wall of tangled earth and stone, at the place where the tree had stood a moment ago, the pale circle of torn ground. He looked at the section of sky now visible where the canopy had been, a clean rectangular wound in the forest ceiling. Then he looked at Gray. The horse was standing still, relaxed now, his ears soft again, his breathing unhurried. He looked, if anything, mildly bored. The way he always looked after the thing that had required his attention had resolved itself. Elias sat with that for a moment. He had no words for it. He didn't try to find any. He rode back down the trail slowly. The wind had settled almost as quickly as it had come, leaving the forest changed, stirred, slightly disheveled, the way a room looks after someone has moved through it quickly. Leaves covered the ground in new patterns. The air smelled different now. Wet and green and broken open. He didn't ride the ridge that evening. He came back to the yard as the light was going, the sky in the west turning to a deep amber that looked, he thought, almost identical to the color of the trees on the hillside. Everything one continuous color. Everything the same fire. He unsaddled Gray in the stable and took more time with the grooming than he usually did. He moved the brush in long even strokes, the way he had learned to do as a boy, and he didn't think about anything in particular. He just paid attention to the warmth of the horse's side beneath his hand, to the way Gray stood quietly, relaxed, occasionally shifting his weight, to the sound of the brush, to the smell of the stable, to the simple, present reality of being here rather than somewhere else, being alive rather than something else. He did not let himself think about the fallen tree too directly. He knew better than to turn events like that over and over in the mind, because the mind would make of them whatever it wanted, would either inflate them into something cosmic or reduce them to pure coincidence, and neither version seemed honest to him. What had happened had happened. Gray had known something he could know. He had listened. That was all. That was enough. He had dinner alone that evening, as he always did now. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the iron stove was low, and he didn't build it up, because the evening was still warm enough from the strange October sun. He ate without much appetite and then sat with his tea and looked at the table. There was a photograph on the shelf across the room. He couldn't see it clearly from where he was sitting, but he knew it without looking. Marta, the summer before she got sick, standing in the lower pasture with the light behind her in that particular way the late afternoon light fell in August. She was laughing at something outside the frame. He couldn't remember what had made her laugh in that moment, and that was the one detail that still bothered him, years later. The laughter was there. The reason for it was gone. He thought about her often on rides. Not deliberately. She would simply appear in his mind the way she always had, present in particular, and he would let her be there for a while, and then the ride would continue and she would recede. He had thought about her today too, he realized. Before Gray stopped, he had been thinking about a thing she used to say, something she had told him early in their life together, when he was still the kind of man who sometimes dismissed things he couldn't explain. She had told him that the things we cannot explain are not the same as the things that did not happen. He remembered arguing with her about it, gently, the way they argued, as if it were a game they both enjoyed. He had told her that an unexplained thing was still an unexplained thing. That the absence of an explanation was not evidence of anything beyond the thing itself. She had let him finish his argument. Then she had smiled and said, simply, "I know. But listen anyway." He hadn't known what she meant. He thought he might know now. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't come through the mind. He hadn't believed that, once. He believed it now, not because one afternoon in October had converted him to anything, but because he had spent 34 years accumulating evidence of it in small, ordinary moments, and today the weight of that evidence had simply become undeniable. Animals knew things. Land knew things. Silence knew things. The world was not made only of what could be explained, and the parts that couldn't be explained were not therefore empty. They were just different. They operated by different rules. They required a different kind of listening. He had listened today. That was the whole of it. He finished his tea and washed his cup and set it on the shelf beside the photograph, and he looked at the photograph for a moment. At the light. At the laughter. At the figure in the frame who no longer moved through the rooms of this house but whose presence remained in it somehow, distributed through objects and angles of light in the particular way the garden grew because of choices she had made. He said goodnight to her, quietly, the way he did most evenings. Not because he thought she could hear it. Because it felt like the right thing to do. Then he went to bed. He checked the trail 2 days later, on foot, bringing the tools to clear what he could and assess what he couldn't. The tree was still there, of course. It would take a chainsaw and a full morning of work to open the trail again, and he made note of it and walked around the crown of the fallen beech, stepping through the enormous tangle of branches, and then stood for a while at the place where it had come down. The root plate stood nearly 2 meters tall. The circle of ground it had left behind was raw and dark. You could see, looking at the underside of the exposed roots, that they had been dying for some time. The outer structure still intact, the inner structure already gone, eaten away by something invisible. The tree had looked healthy from the outside. It had been failing from within for what looked like years. Elias crouched at the edge of the torn earth and looked at it. A tree could look strong and be hollow. He knew that. He had known it about trees for most of his life. But standing here, looking at this particular root plate in the particular light of this October morning, he felt the truth of it differently. More personally. More quietly. He had been that tree, a little, after Marta. He had looked steady on the outside. He had kept the farm running. He had done what was asked of him by the days and the land and the ordinary work of being alive. He had not let anything visible collapse. But underneath, something had been changing. Slowly. Privately. The interior landscape shifting in ways he hadn't quite tracked. He was not sure he was still hollow. He thought, standing here, that he might not be. That maybe the hollowing was not a permanent condition but a season. Something that ran its course. Something that left changed ground behind, but ground that could still hold. He stood there for a while, in the sharp October air, in the silence of the forest after the drama of the fallen tree, in the quiet that was the ordinary kind now, full of small sounds and ordinary life resuming. Then he walked back down the trail, back through the beeches, back past the stone marker, back to the work of the day. He rode the trail again 3 weeks later, after he had cleared the fallen beech and dragged the wood to the edge of the property. The trail was open. The gap in the canopy where the tree had stood let in a long rectangle of November sky, pale and high and very clear. Gray moved through the section without hesitation, without any pause at all. His ears were soft, his pace unhurried. He navigated the slightly changed surface of the trail, the packed earth still marked by the work of clearing, and then he was through it and onto the familiar ridge path, and the valley opened up on the right in its November colors, muted now, the dramatic autumn already past, the trees bare or nearly bare, the landscape simpler and more skeletal and in its own way more beautiful for the simplification. Elias rode the full ridge. He took his time. The light was low and golden, the way November light was, angled steeply, making long shadows of everything and turning the dry grass along the path to the color of old brass. He thought about nothing in particular. He breathed the air. He listened to the ordinary sounds of the forest being itself. At the high point of the ridge, where the trail curved east and the whole valley spread out below, he stopped Gray and let the horse stand while he looked. It was the same view he had seen from this point 100 times or more. The valley below. The river in its low winter running, glinting where the light caught it. The rooftops of the small town at the far end. The hills closing in from the north and south, dark with pine above the bare deciduous line. His property at the far end, small from here, the farm buildings just distinguishable, the lower pasture still showing some green. All of it exactly as it had always been. He breathed out slowly. Gray shifted beneath him, a small adjustment of weight, and then went still again. The light moved on the valley. Shadows from somewhere overhead, clouds or birds or both, passed over the far hillside, and the colors changed briefly and then returned to what they had been. A long time ago, Marta had stood at this same point with him. They had ridden up together on a day much like this one, and she had stood in her stirrups slightly and looked out over everything and said, "It's all still here." As if she had been afraid it might not be. He understood now, from the other side of loss, what she might have meant by that. The tendency to expect the world to match the interior. To expect that when something large and essential goes from your life, the landscape must follow. Must go gray or strange or somehow reflect the enormity of what is absent. The surprise, each time, of finding an unchanged. Still whole. Still here. Indifferent in the most honest and necessary way. It's all still here. Yes, he thought. It is. He rode down as the sun touched the hills to the west. The light was going fast, the way it did in November, not gradually but in stages, each stage slightly darker than the last, the warmth draining out of the air with visible speed. He rode without urgency. Gray knew the way home as well as he did. At the stable, he unsaddled and groomed and filled the water and the hay, working in the low light from the single bulb above the door, and when he was done he stood for a moment with his hand on Gray's neck, not thinking anything in particular, just present. The horse was warm beneath his palm. Still. Breathing. Alive, in that particular and uncomplicated way that animals were alive, fully in without qualification, without any of the overlay of worry or memory or anticipation that complicated human living. Elias left his hand there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said goodnight to the horse the same way he said goodnight to the photograph in the kitchen, quietly and without expectation, and walked across the yard to the house. The stars were beginning, faint at first and then more certain as the sky deepened. He stopped in the yard and looked up. A habit he had gotten from his father, who had used the stars to check the weather, and from Marta, who had simply liked to look at them for no functional reason at all. He looked for no functional reason. The cold came in from the north, clean and dry, carrying the smell of the hills. He breathed it in. Inside the house, something waited. The kitchen. The fire he would build. The tea. The quiet that was his, entirely his now, in every room. He had been afraid of that quiet, in the beginning. The completeness of it. The way it filled every corner that used to hold another person's presence. He was less afraid of it now. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly and without a manual, how to live inside that kind of quiet without disappearing into it. How to be alone in a way that was still being alive. How to let the days carry their weight without that weight becoming unbearable. He was not certain he was succeeding, but he was still here. And the trail was open. And the horse was in the stable. And the stars were beginning. And if you are still here, listening to this, in the quiet of wherever you are tonight, then maybe you already know something about what Elias learned on that October afternoon. That there are moments when the right thing to do is not to push forward. That silence sometimes carries information that sound cannot. That something outside of us, sometimes, knows the way. And that when it stops, even without explanation, even without any visible reason, it might be worth pausing, turning, listening, just for a moment, just long enough. If you would like to stay a little longer with stories like this one, you can like the video, or simply rest here for a while. You're welcome either way. Elias Vaughan lived another 22 years on that land. He rode Gray until the horse was old and slow and content to walk the lower trails at a pace that suited them both. When Gray finally went, Elias buried him at the edge of the upper pasture, near the old stone marker that leaned south. He spent a full day doing it. He worked slowly. He didn't talk to anyone about it. That was fine. He kept the trail open. He walked it sometimes when he couldn't ride. He marked the gap in the beech canopy each year as it changed, as the light coming through it shifted with the growth of the surrounding trees, as the bare sky above the fallen trees' place slowly filled in again with new growth reaching up to reclaim the space. You couldn't tell, after a while, that anything had fallen. The forest had closed over the absence the way forests always do, the way living things always do, slowly and without announcement, filling in toward the light. He thought about that sometimes. He thought it was probably a good model for most things. On the last photograph anyone took of Elias Vaughan, he is standing in the lower pasture in late afternoon light, and he is looking at something outside the frame, and whoever took the photograph said, later, that he looked as if he had just heard something. Not startled. Not afraid. Something else. Like someone listening to a sound that was very quiet and very far away. And smiling slightly, because he recognized it. If this story found you tonight, in whatever quiet or noise your life holds just now, you can leave a like, or share a thought below. And if you'd like to return to stories like this one, stories told slowly, for long evenings and gentle hours, you're welcome to join us. Subscribe, if you'd like. We'll be here.